Hello and welcome back to The Marketing Hustle. If it's your first time here, I keep saying it, but where have you been? I'm your host, Lottie Unwin. If you love hearing unfiltered stories from bold brands on how they do their marketing, then you're in the right place. Today, I chatted to Pip Murray, founder of Pip Nut, that makes these delicious nut butters, buttercups, and recently, peanut butter stuffed oat bars. We talked about, honestly, everything from brand guidelines to how tough relationships at work really do take work. I really hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I learned a lot from this conversation. We haven't spoken for a few years.
No.
Which feels very overdue. And I am laughing that we live like 10 minutes away from each other and this is what it's taken. Down the road. Pip and I run into each other, like physically run into each other or bump into each other sporadically and like do a wave from afar. And that's been the extent of like actually hearing how it's going.
I know.
So I feel like I need a kind of 3-year update on how your brand and strategy's evolved.
Yeah.
Like step back from 2024, 5, think about where
God,
you
this is like a therapy session now. Go through the archives.
Share.
Yeah, tell you the pain points. Yeah, I mean, the brand feels like it's really grown up in the last few years, actually. I mean, it's funny how in the moment when you're iterating and tweaking and playing with your brand, like you almost don't spot the shifts and the changes so much. It's only to your point when you look back over like 3, 4, 5 years that you can actually see how far you've come in terms of clarity. But I guess like setting the scene, probably when we last spoke to you, we were kind of, our portfolio of products were still predominantly in our nut butters, whereas I guess over the last sort of year or so, we're starting to broaden out, and that's been a big kind of shift for us. So we've launched our cereal bars over the summer, which is a real kind of push into snacking, which is an exciting territory to kind of move into, competitive, hard to crack, but one that everyone told us not to do, but we decided to go there anyway. So that's been really exciting over the summer. Nerve-wracking, I have to say, whenever you launch any new innovation, especially innovation, which is really key to your strategy, it's a bit nail-biting at points. Trying to like not put pressure on it whilst at the same time knowing it's really important. Yeah. It's like this fine line that you constantly have to tread. But actually, in terms of just like the brand and like the kind of feel of it and like the kind of more the softer side in some ways, I've kind of got I think that me and the team have got real clarity about what we stand for as a brand, both in terms of our sort of positioning as well as also just the look and feel, creative and tone of voice. We've done a lot of work in the last year in particular in really refining what is it that Pip Nut is and how do we show up? What are our key codes that we want to make sure that we're harnessing? Because I definitely found like we're 10 years at the end of this year. So in January, we turned 10. So I was saying earlier to you that I feel like an old timer, and because it feels like I've been around the block recently. 10 years feels like an amazing milestone, but also, yeah, you've ridden the waves of quite a few waves by this point.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's sort of funny how you realise how long it does take to build a brand. I know that's nothing new. You know, a good brand takes time. But even just getting clarity on like what is your brand. And I mean, like for us, like I think as you have different agencies come into your brand or different team members or different creatives kind of, you know, look at your brand, you know that sometimes there can be drift or you can kind of move in directions or you get influence from, you know, new members of the team. And actually, sometimes you need to stop and start again, if that makes sense, and pick apart what it is that you stand for. So actually I kind of feel like I'm going into like this next sort of year, sort of 10 years, like with real kind of sense of, you know, how we're going to sort of stand out from the crowd, but also what are we like constantly going to, you know, hone and define what we are. If that
Did
makes
you
sense.
know you didn't know that? Like you say, brands take time, and it's like we know that on paper, and yet we're all 3 years into a brand and we think we're there. Have you had that sense of the gap?
I think it's really hard when you're in the first few years because I think you're often sprinting so fast as a brand when you're building it that I think it naturally you're not necessarily as aware of. But I more mean in the mind of like the consumer, I think it takes a really long time for people to even know who you are fundamentally. I mean, that's just basic awareness stuff, but it does just take a long time, I think, to get there with consumers and for them to be familiar with your brand and and your products and what you stand for. But then also I think, to your point in terms of like having clarity internally as well, I think that's what also takes time to and you need to be quite strong with it. And just to kind of put that in context, I guess like for us, even like, so we're Pip Nut, so we've got quite a strong logo, and then the logo is like a squirrel, and like for ages we've, this is quite specific to us, but we've like tussled, like how much do we lean on that like asset, like the squirrel, like it's, you know, a big part of our logo, and a lot of our tone of voice riffs on like, you know, squirreling away or foraging and, you know, the wilderness, if you like. And sometimes it's sort of getting clarity about what you want to really make sure you're leaning in to be distinctive about. Yeah. So, you know, we've done ATL campaigns in the past where we've shot like real life squirrels and blown them up on the tube and had like testimonial quotes, and the squirrels were kind of representing the feelings in the quotes. And it's funny, I think you that campaign that we did, which was our first Above the Line campaign, really just felt amazing. It really felt like it was Pip Nut in its true sense, and we were really distinctive, clear. Nobody else could have done that campaign. It felt great. And then a few campaigns later, we kind of drifted away from it, and actually we've kind of come full circles to almost identify, actually, what was it about that particular campaign that really worked us up for our brand? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think you do test and learn a lot as you're building your brand, and you'll naturally play on different creative mediums or media, or just ways of getting your brand out into the world. And I think you then have a bit of time to like consolidate again and figure out what actually has been working over the last few years, and trying to like double down on those. So I think that's what I mean in terms of I've got clarity. I think we've got clarity about like how we show up basically, and what has worked in the past and what hasn't worked. And some of that's quite intuitive, and some of it's like data-led, I guess.
It's really interesting to talk about test and learn in the context of brand. I think that's not a natural pairing of phrase.
Yeah.
The learning, has that been internally what's felt right? Or has that been data-led of what has resonated with a consumer?
It's been a mixture, I think. I mean, with all of our campaigns, we'll obviously have data tracking and like what drove the most kind of awareness and, you know, response to in terms of memorability and things like that. So we will measure after each campaign the performance of it. So that will definitely like be one of the things that we'll be leaning on to say, like, actually that particular campaign that I just spoke about, which is the one we did in 2019, it performed unbelievably well. Like it was the most kind of, I'm going to get the phrase wrong, but it was the most kind of memorable campaign that we ever delivered in terms of, and the messages that we were trying to land, which is around naturalness and taste, was the one that stepped on our kind of brand attributes the most in that particular campaign. But then it was a feeling, like I remember you probably don't remember it. And
I do remember it.
But we're bringing it back in a new guise in January. And but I remember just being like, this just feels good, and it's just that gut. And I think that's why you have to always be listening to, like, marketing is that, isn't it? It's both, you know, it has to be data-driven, it has to be consumer-led, but it also is like what feels right for you and what you stood for right back in the day. And I just loved like how playful it was and how silly it was, and it just felt good, and it was very clean as an ad. Like I loved how stripped back it was, and it felt intuitively quite Pip and Nut. So yeah, there was lots of things about that. So I think sometimes you do stuff when you're out, you know, executing all the tactics that you just it feels good, and you have to follow that, I think. And often if it feels good, and then you look at kind of if you've got data to support things, and you can almost post-rationalise actually that is both good in terms of from a founder point of view. I liked how that landed, but you can also see, I think, that from a consumer point of view, actually it had traction. And normally because it's the more distinctive stuff that feels more defined to your brand, I think, are the things that therefore also perform better because they are less wallpaper, if you like.
Yeah, and you're affirming your founder instinct.
Yeah.
The data's kind of saying you were right.
Yeah.
And this was the logic to that instinct.
Exactly.
Is the opposite true when something doesn't feel quite right, but you push it through anyway? Like, talk about how when you've come off track as well as when you find your way back on track.
Yeah, I think when you come off track, there's definitely been things where after the fact it probably didn't feel like it was as effective. I don't know, I'm just probably going to pull on random examples now, but innovation is super hard to do well. You know, bouncing off your core, like, is notoriously difficult. And yeah, in our like third or fourth year, we launched a range of almond milks, which again you might remember, and in lots of ways that felt really true to us. Like it had nuts at the core of the brand, of the product rather. So it felt like a kind of intuitively, we had a place and a right to win in that particular category. And, it was big on trend at the time. It was like the boom of like almond, like nut milks generally, or kind of alternative milks back in, it's like 17, 18, 19 now. And and I was really convinced it was going to land really well. And I did the product development. So it was a bit like, it was the thing that I'd created. So I was like totally in it. But it was funny because when it landed in the market and we like did loads of sampling in Whole Foods, and even now when we launch products, we do sampling in Whole Foods, like the whole team. You just get a good feel on like how people are responding in the moment when you're testing the product or like sampling the product. But I remember standing in like a Whole Foods sampling the product, and I've done loads of samplings because, in Nut Butter when we launched, there's so many. So I could tell like when people liked something or not. And I remember just getting these kind of like, people would try the nut milks that we had and they go, nice. And that was pretty much it. Whereas whenever they'd have our nut butters, they'd be like, oh man, like they'd like react in a much more like, yeah, great. And I'd see them pick it up. Whereas with nut milks, it never really landed. And it was like for a number of things that I think that particular product failed, and we pulled it about a year and a half into the journey. And I think there was one thing around the product itself, Pip Nut, we've always like focused on taste as like number one. We're not a functionally driven brand. We're all about taste, flavour, like having fun with food. Nut milks, whilst they were all right from a taste, they are still more veering in the functional space and more kind of unless you never drink a nut milk and go, oh my God, that was amazing. It's always...
Well, you rarely drink a nut milk on its own.
Or that
an ingredient.
As well.
Yeah.
It's always kind of a bit of a backdrop and has a functional element to it. So I think from a product point of view, I think our consumers look to our brand for a bit of permissible indulgence and that almost treat factor, whereas nut milks they just aren't that, and that's just part of the kind of the product, I think, and the category. So it never really felt like it kind of fitted into like what we stood for as a brand and our approach to food and our food philosophy. And then there are a whole other reasons why I think they also failed. But I think in terms of just sticking to brand, like whilst it felt like something we should do, actually only after the fact did we realise that we're much more about like permissible indulgence. And like if you look at our range now, we've got nut butter cups, which were probably on the outer spectrum of like so indulgence because they're confectionery. But then even our oat bars are, still quite a delicious, natural, but kind of very taste-orientated product. So I think even just trying to create some boundaries as to where you start and stop, because with any brand, you can do a lot, can't you? And you've got to be able to kind of really decide what you're going to stand for so that it makes it easier when you're then talking to consumers about your brand.
And you've shifted your red thread to nut butter, not nuts.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We started with nut butter, obviously.
Yeah.
And I think over the next few years, we'll still remain that. However, I think there will be a bit of a shift in how we start to become more synonymous with nuts. But I think you have to take your shoppers and consumers on a journey, and you can't just suddenly switch it. So for us, like the leap into oat bars and bars generally, like I think there will be a bit more flex where we could maybe use just nuts and not nut butter. And these are sort of weird things.
Yes, because you build... You kind of to take the next step.
Exactly. And that's it. You can't jump too quickly. Yeah. It's always like those rings outer, like you kind of start with your core and then you creep as slowly outwards as you possibly can. And that you've got to do it in stages so that you don't become this Frankenstein brand to people, and it's quite hard for people to follow that thread. Yeah. So I think at some point, Pip and Nut, so it's not Pip and Nut butter, so it can be. I think we can, but it takes time, I think, to do that.
Yeah. You said earlier you launched into snacking, but everyone told you not to.
Yes.
Why are you doing something everyone's telling you not to do?
It's funny, you speak to anyone that's either worked in like a snacking business, and I've got some really good friends who've led snacking businesses and quite big ones, and they'd be like, oh, it's like a bloodbath, like it's so competitive, so crowded, especially it's like the healthy snacking space, it's established, it's not like this new emergent thing, like, it's 10 years ago it was new, now it's not. Why? There was a piece of me that it really bothered me that there were lots of brands in cereal bars in particular that had peanut butter flavoured stuff, and they were often like the top performing SKUs were like that particular flavour or like peanuts flavoured stuff. Yet we weren't playing in that space, and I was like, oh, it's just
because there's a peanut game and I'm not in it.
Yeah, hang on a minute. Especially when it was peanut butter, I was like, come on, like we are the peanut butter brand, like we should be there. And then I think things that kind of gave us more confidence, and again, it's that kind of almost post-rationalising piece, was that when we did do a bit of consumer research around, we had a really great idea for the product, which was the stuff bars that we launched in the end. But what gave us confidence was that we knew quite a lot of our shoppers were shopping already in cereal bars. So we knew that our consumers were there. It's kind of an obvious thing to say. We also knew that our awareness with those cereal bar shoppers was actually quite high, as it already was. So we kind of had data that showed that our awareness with cereal bar shoppers was at like 56% without having actually done any marketing. And I think if I was a brand starting from ground zero, I would be nervous about going into cereal bars. You know, you've got the Mondelez, you've got the Unilevers, Mars, all playing in that space. But because we had a brand that had already built a foundation with nut butter, and we'd, you know, done a lot of brand building over the last 10 years, so there is a familiarity at least with the brand, it felt like actually the right moment to kind of take advantage of that and actually use that to be able to kind of win in that particular category. And then we just had a really great consumer and sort of inspired idea for the product, which is basically like take a porridge bowl, people have nut butter on top, like make it onto in an oat bar that you can have on the go. And so, I guess it was a combination of all those things that kind of made us think, well, let's give it a go, because actually we have a right to play there, and I think we could win. So, but it has also been one that I think if you go into a competitive category, you have to invest behind it and like recognise that. So I think the key is making sure that your foundation where you started is as solid as it possibly can do, so that you can invest more heavily elsewhere. And that was, I think this year we've just become the number 2 brand in the peanut butter category in the last 52-week read, which is really exciting.
That's a massive win.
Yeah, it is. I mean, at points I was like, you know, you always say these things when you're starting out, being like, we will be number 1. But there's always a bit when you're really in the early days, you're like, I'm not sure, but like, we'll try.
I'll keep saying it.
I'll keep saying it, maybe it will come true. But it's really cool when it actually starts to tip. And it has been a tipping point in the last year or so where we've just had this momentum. And it's not just distribution, it's like rate of sale being built and it's penetration. So I think even gives us more confidence not to like forget about nut butter, but just know that we've got actually a really solid brand there, and it's continue to nurture that, but actually does give you a bit of flex, I think, to be able to say, I think we could land well somewhere else as well. But ask me in 2 years' time, because multi-category stuff and going multi, as you very well know, is really, really hard. And splitting that budget.
How have you launched it?
How have we launched it? So we've gone straight into Tesco. They were our main launch partner, but it's now in Waitrose, and we've got another retailer launching in about a month or 2. So it's been kind of focus on grocery in terms of distribution. But for us, actually, it's been an interesting one about going back to almost like the challenger brand. We are a challenger brand, regardless of like, because it's not really about size, but going back to our roots a little bit and how we sort of built the brand in nut butter, because it's not to say that in nut butter we spend loads of money and just, you know, act like a big player, but it's a slightly different mindset where you're like a category leader and you have to really like, you know,
number 2 in the category.
Yeah,
you've got to behave like number 2.
Exactly. You've got to have the category story and be rolling it out to the trade and, you know, go in strong. Whereas in this particular space, again, we have to be those like real hustlers because our budgets are small in comparison to our competitors, and you know we're going to be like the pioneers again. And so it's a lot more test and learn again versus with nut butter. We still do that, but we've got more of a playbook that we're working to. But I think it is going back to just how we built the brand grassroots. So we did a lot of over like the last 6 months with launching bars, like lots of sampling with, you know, what we call our tribes, which is like our run, you know, we did sponsor the Royal Parks Half Marathon and done loads of stuff with the cycle and, you know, other like frame and that lot. So really kind of targeting that kind of lifestyle consumer, but specifically kind of lifestyle sports, if you like, which is kind of where the brand story came from.
It really is back to basics.
And actually, I think there's something really nice about, or, you know, recognising that if it worked back in the day, like rinse and repeat, don't be afraid of that. And actually, there's something really nice about going back to some of those activations that we did right back in the day and maybe doing them a bit more polished than what we did before. But actually, those felt good at the time, and actually they are our core demographics and the perfect opportunity to sample. So sampling has been all about this particular product. But it has been interesting, I have to say, because our nut butter is a back of store, in the cupboard, grocery item. we've now entered really much more heavily in the world of impulse. So again, it's like a completely different muscle to flex, and which I'm enjoying and I think it's a good stretch for us as a team. But you know, it is also pretty different in the way that you activate your brand and build the brand in that sense.
Like, unpack that a bit more.
Well, I guess, like, first of all, you've got out of home, which is, like, from a distribution point of view, a real kind of, like, weedy kind of way of getting your brand in hand.
Because you just wouldn't have thought about that as a distribution channel for nut butter.
It was, like, a low-level thing that we could have done, but, you know, it's not something you eat on the go, so you're not having to unlock those.
Rogue.
Yeah, I mean, you could try, but it'd be messy. Whereas like a snacking product, obviously it's something you'd have on the go. So you want to be in all your QSRs and like in your offices and convenience shops and stuff like that. Whereas it is a focus for us in nut butter, but lower down the pile. Groceries, the focus. So there's like distribution is a bit different in the way you approach it, and obviously field sales and, you know, building the accounts like that as well are key. But then from a brand point of view, like, we did do sampling with nut butter in that we do like toast bars, but you could never get the volume out because it's difficult to sample a jar. It's expensive, you know, whatever. It's whereas bars obviously is easier to do that and actually
but
drive
like made
quite
to
physically.
be, yeah.
So in some ways it's really freeing because suddenly all these like activations that we always used to want to do and in our sort of core are quite difficult to.
They were just a real pain before.
Yeah, you'd have to be like, right, how are we going to create toast for 20,000 people? I mean, it's just not possible. Whereas for the Royal Parks Half Marathon, you can sample, we sampled 40,000 bars in that one activation, which would have been incredibly difficult.
That's a lot of toast.
And they're eating it in the moment as well. So, yeah, it's not overly complicated, but I guess it's sort of trying to figure out your kind of sampling strategy and really make sure you're kind of refining it and making it as effective as possible.
What's harder for impulse versus back of store?
I think we're still figuring that one out.
To be confirmed.
I think it's just to be confirmed. I think we're still kind of refining. I think exactly how we kind of show up in impulse. The challenge with nut butter and has in the years over building it is that it's a much slower moving category though. So to get people into the category, you know, people buy it 4 times a year. The frequency is pretty low as a product. So actually, it can take a while to get penetration, if that makes sense. Whereas in impulse, in lots of ways, it's much easier to kind of recruit shoppers, but it's also quite easy, I think, to lose them. Yeah. You know, someone might try you once and move on to something else because people are a bit more driven by like quite literally impulse and they want to try something. Whereas, I think nut butter, once you get someone in, actually, that's you not always, but you know, you get them into the brand and they'll probably either buy again or they might buy a kilo. So actually, it's sort of a slower build, but then once you've got them, they're a bit more loyal as anyone ever will be. But you know, you can tend to get them into the brand because, people won't necessarily. It just takes a while to build trust with someone to buy a jar of something. I don't know, like you don't want to buy something that's going to sit in your cupboard, so it just takes longer, I guess.
It's a treat. So you take it there's like a little bit of friction in choosing the right one.
Yeah. So it's a slightly different mindset that you have to take to it. But it's interesting how you can kind of like how one can support the other, and I guess the time will tell as to whether or not, you know, will our oat bars launch actually be the thing that drives our awareness higher, because actually it's, you know, a product that people might see in multiple different touch points and it helps support our overall awareness.
And is that what's ultimately driving trial of the peanut butter?
Could be.
Store. That's the vision, right?
That is the vision. Whether it plays out is another ballgame, I think.
Interesting. You referenced having a playbook for nut butter, which feels like a great 10-year, like written the playbook, done.
Yeah.
What are the like key bedrocks of good nut butter marketing by Pip Nut?
So the playbook's probably not written down as neatly as that. But in terms of, I guess for us, it's about playing with the short and the long all the time, and that's just general brand building, isn't it? But with nut butter, we're a bit more established. You know, making sure that we are driving top of funnel awareness. So ATL, you know, above the line campaigns are really key, I think, particularly with this category, because you do need to kind of get that awareness up in order to then pull them down into the brand. So, but particularly, and this is where like creative all comes in, is like making sure that creative is super distinctive and ultimately driven on taste is like the main focus for us. But then when it comes to kind of like lower down the funnel, like social media has always been a real strong suit of ours as a brand, and Certainly nut butter has been one about like use occasions and that kind of recipes and things like that. So that's been a kind of key part of the marketing mix and making sure we get that right. As boring as it sounds, like formats and pricing and the right promo strategy, like fundamental, if I'm honest. Like, and some of the key shifts I think we've noticed over the years is like getting that really right, knowing exactly what your positioning from a price point is, making sure you have the right formats and sizing is key, because at certain sizing is like more, you get the right price points and promotional price points.
Why do you think that's so misunderstood?
Well, I don't know if it is misunderstood. I think it was maybe just something, I started the business with no experience in FMCG, and I didn't even think, I knew I wanted a certain price point and positioning, but I didn't really think about sizing in a particularly smart or clever way. So I think there is just a bit of a kind of maturing about like understanding it. So some of it sounds so obvious, but like I had like 250-gram jars. They were quite small versus what was normal in the market. It was like 350, 400, and just you look small and expensive, and so it's just not got the right kind of format.
It's really hard to win.
Yeah, exactly. So having a really clear format strategy and pricing strategy, and then key promotional price points, and investing in category as well, making sure that you can really sell the story correctly, and actually that being really key to kind of building out your space and visibility in stores being absolutely fundamental, I think, over the past few years. It's like telling the right stories to the trade and building those relationships. Yeah, and I guess it's like, the marketing mix around PR and things like that have always been kind of key parts of our brand, and also innovation when it comes to kind of different flavours and limited editions have also been quite key to kind of help drive and build excitement.
How do you think about PR? I think PR sort of, dare I say it, has PR lost its way a bit in a world where we don't read print media? And I think you have a definition of it that's working for the business, but it's not necessarily print coverage, I would assume.
Yeah, you're right. Especially now with like LinkedIn, you think some of the reach you can get.
Yeah.
You're case in point, but like you can actually draw, and podcasts as well. I know that is a form of PR, isn't it? But it's still a really important part of our mix. I think it's been interesting actually over the years, and I don't know whether or not it's still what younger brands will lean on. But I think the first few years, like we could not. We just got coverage left, right, centre. It was so relatively easy to get good, decent coverage, not just in like FMCG trade press, but like really good
actual press. Yeah.
And what value that got, I don't know in the long term. I know they give you the stats about like how, but it's a finger in the air and
mad numbers.
You can't really trust it. But I think for us, it's sort of like we've had to kind of evolve the story. So like, yes, we talk about the startup, scale up journey still, but for us building on that and sort of maturing as a business, so does your sort of story that you go out to the trade with or to press with. And, for us, like sustainability and what we kind of stand for has been a bigger thread of like what we've spoken to PR about. So I personally still think there's value in it, but I do think it's harder to get good coverage than it's ever been before. And that's partly because journalists are really just pressed in terms of time. So they don't necessarily have time to do big, long form articles. And they've got long kind of lists of people that are reaching out. So I think it's harder to get as much away as I think it was maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think it's not as easy, but I still think there's a value in terms of sort of telling your story. But I think it depends on, at the time when Pip Nut launched, I had, female founder was still like relatively unusual, and it got a lot of press off the back of, I think, having a really nice story to tell and a position, I guess, in the fact that, flying the flag, I guess, for female entrepreneurship and things like that. And so it was really valuable, I think, for us over the years. So I would still invest, and we still invest in it now.
So the PR is still primarily targeted with print coverage.
Yeah.
Interesting that you mentioned LinkedIn and like personal brand.
Yeah.
Influencers, is that part of the way you think about PR?
Yeah, I always link that a bit more to social. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that's kind of where we thread it through. And yeah, influencers are really, like for instance, in the campaign that we're building for January, like we've got a big thread of influencer work that we're doing, where there'll be sort of content creation for us. And so, yeah, it is important and is as much of our mix as probably PR as well. They just serve a slightly different purpose, I guess.
Yeah. You've always been very good at social. This is like a 10-year-old thing. what's the secret?
What's the secret?
Tell us.
Always iterate. As you know, the landscape is constantly changing. And so we've got about, if we include our ECRM, about 270,000 followers across all of our social platforms, of which Instagram's still our strongest. But LinkedIn is actually it's about 40,000 on LinkedIn. Wow. For Pip and Nut alone. But I would say it is getting harder, and we find it difficult. And so actually constantly refreshing your strategy is fundamental. So whilst we have quite a big following, it doesn't always mean that we reach all of them when we post, as you very well know. So for us, it's just sort of really being honed in on what your platform and what your content is doing for people. And really, I think sometimes in the past we've been a little bit what we want to talk about versus about thinking about how do people want to consume this, because it's entertainment fundamentally. So you need to make sure you're really thinking about what's useful for other people rather than pushing things out. So I think for us actually a big job over the next sort of 6 months or so is to refresh that, because what worked for us in the past, and we used to get 2,000-3,000 followers every week easily without having to try very hard, whereas in the last sort of 3 years it's been pretty hard to get traction and even reach those people that are following you. So we haven't got actually that perfect yet. It's for us a constant iteration, but it is interesting which platforms suddenly get traction. Like LinkedIn for us is really powerful, and actually
so interesting from your brand
even
page.
From a brand point of view, and it's our fastest growing channel at the moment even. And then my LinkedIn alongside that, kind of they complement each other, I guess. It's not necessarily where we'd have initially thought the growth would come from, but it has.
But follow it.
Yeah, follow it.
Be grateful for growth.
Yes, exactly.
Take the growth where it comes and follow it.
Yeah.
How are you going to approach the new social strategy?
Yeah,
because I think everyone is going to resonate with, yes, the last 3 years have been hard. Yes, I need to do something different, but...
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to reveal our trade secrets.
Sorry.
I think there is a bit about working with experts. I hate to outsource the issue, but I think there is a bit. We've got a couple of people that are real experts, and specifically for us, we're really focusing on recipe content and things like that, because you only need to go onto the likes of Bosch and Mob Kitchen. That kind of real rough and ready content really gets traction, and I think as a brand and a product that you put in stuff brownies to salads, actually there's a real opportunity to kind of really own taste and recipe content and be quite useful for people in a bit more of a dynamic and playful way, less curated, more fun and easy and accessible. So I think finding people that can help us refine that, and then I think the key is about getting the talent internally from a content point of view to really kind of roll out the execution on it, and making sure that we've trained people well to be able to actually create that content and be quite agile with it.
There's a real nuance in that, because you're training someone to make content your audience likes, not the content you want.
And that's the thing, for instance, sustainability comms we struggle with sometimes because it won't ever really get traction in terms of reach, which I don't think you should expect it necessarily to reach the same amount as, I don't know, a post with a dog eating someone up. So that will always perform better, and annoyingly. But fine. So there are a bit of a balance, I think, about what you want to make sure you're communicating, which might not be the thing that people will consume the most. So I think there'll be a balance we need to strike there, but I think we're probably doing a little bit too much talking at people rather than sort of being helpful, if that makes sense. So I think it will be a bit of a switch for us. And it's funny, I think, as well, how much you put your brand out on Instagram, on certain platforms, how much you need to actually push your physical packs, if you like, actually to make something feel more intuitively, a bit more native. I think you have to almost pull back a little bit on brand, and therefore, be less marketing, basically, trying to be more of a content
has to feel
creator.
uncomfortably authentic. I keep hearing this kind of recurring theme, which I think is such a good piece of advice, around going to people who make brilliant content about the kind of thing you're trying to do. So I was chatting to some of the All Plants team who were describing like a similar process. Like, okay, we want to make amazing food content. So we're not going to look at other food brands.
Yeah.
We're going to look at chefs.
Yeah, exactly.
Who is authentically making content for this audience without something to sell.
Yeah.
They're the people to learn from.
Yeah.
Not cross-category.
Yeah, I completely agree.
It's so obvious, but we just spend so much time in like our myopic industry bubbles.
Yeah, navel gazing about other people's what they're doing and actually...
Yeah, like worrying about the person 2 shelves down from you when actually like the consumer isn't following them or you.
No, exactly.
They're following people that entertain and inspire them.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And you don't really want to be sold out hard on social media, really. I know you get sponsored posts and all of this coming at you, but actually the best stuff is entertaining.
Well, you're not going to engage in it. You pay you understand that you get ads, and that's part of the deal of the joyful bits of the platform.
Yeah.
So our role as brands is to be the joy bit, not the uncomfortable ad bit. Yeah. Unless we're paying for it and we understand that it's separate.
Yeah, exactly that.
How do you keep the team close to the customer? Like, there's a really interesting dynamic between this is how we want to do the business, this is what we want to say, having a strong brand that has a strong point of view and is tight. Yeah. And fundamentally being customer centric.
Yeah. You know what? I think that's really interesting over the years about... certainly something I've had to like learn a bit more to like strike the balance of making sure you're listening and not just being like, I know what's best for this brand.
This is what I want.
This is my way. I'm the customer. You never assume, and like, but it's also still balancing that intuition bit, which is like informed by so many different things. But how do we keep everyone close? I mean, one of the things that we do, which we set up about 5 years ago, was we have this sort of pool of like secret squirrels. So there's like about 200 of them, which or just over that we've recruited through like our ECRM and our social media. And they basically are our eyes and ears. They're like our core demographic. So we know exactly who they are. We've profiled them. So we know like they're not necessarily, they are the slightly like niche Pip and Nut followers, but they're the ones that really kind of know and care about the brand probably more than most consumers. And so we test loads of things with them. So we'll send them bits of innovation that we're working on. We'll ask them about their like habits when it comes to snacking or all these different things. And they'll kind of give us feedback and they'll give us this kind of constant kind of flow of information. Now you have to still take it as like it's a subsection, and they tend to be like kind of, we call them more like super foodies. They're kind of like slightly on the edge of like, you know, they'll be a bit more forward thinking when it comes to trends and stuff, so, or health and things like that. So they won't be like perfect, but they'll give us a bit of a gauge.
It might be a bit forward looking.
Yeah, exactly.
Might give you like a little canary that something's coming.
Totally, exactly. Then I think there is like really basic stuff of like, you can do so much in store and at shelf. Like, and even now, like I said, like when we first launched our stuff bars, like we make sure that everyone, whether it's like your FD right the way through to, you know, our marketing interns will all do samplings across like the first 3 months of a launch, and we'll get all that feedback coming back. So people will give us like what people have said live from the sampling. And actually, I mean, your FD necessarily doesn't need to be in touch with the consumer, but I do think it just helps keep you connected to what it is that you're actually doing.
Yeah, those numbers of people eating snacks, exactly, and making toast,
and it makes you really like care in a way that like nothing else will. And doing events, like I have to say, like it's the best team building stuff is always doing events. Like so we did the Royal Parts, and actually seeing all the feedback from that race, and you know, listening to people and being observant is just such a great way to like learn and get kind of a feel for what's your like people are actually thinking about your brand. And then of course there's like loads of other ways that we've done testing, whether it's you know, focus groups to, you know, surveys via a test. So we kind of do a whole mixture of stuff. And we've definitely kind of over the years got better at kind of figuring out where do we want to go really deep on something and where do you just want a little bit of like validation and sense check or just an external bit lens without having to necessarily do a really robust piece of insight that kind of gives you qual and quant together and that sort of stuff. Yeah. But I definitely think it's been interesting because our consumer, who we target, you know, in the first few years, it was basically picture profile me, like in my mid-20s, living in London, healthy-ish, you know, active, all of that, you know, relatively, you know, middle class, all of that. So that was like core demographic, and only in the last sort of few years that we've started to really open up to like more of a family market, which obviously I have a daughter, so I am a family market. And so it's kind of interesting to remind yourself that a family is also an individual and like a person's within a family.
Yes, all of those things that were true are still true of you. You just have a child.
You're not just suddenly mum as opposed to, the person you were like 10 years ago.
So much about the assumptions we make about
Isn't it? Sometimes
you're even living that experience and you're still a bit thrown by it.
Yeah, exactly. That you want to put people in boxes and be like, no, but you're the family.
Yeah.
You
I have a slide and I need you in a corner of the slide.
Whereas actually everyone's like a mishmash of everything. But we have like broadened out to be more like family orientated because this product is something that, a family would eat and we appeal to that. So that's where actually sometimes you have to slightly make sure you get out of your London bubble, hipster mode and listen and recognise that your consumers are shopping in Asda and Morrison's as well as, your Whole Foods. So I think that's where you have to like not assume that you know everything about your consumers' lives and get a reality check as well. Because sometimes you get into this, you think you're the epitome of their life, but in actual fact you're just a very small speck in a number of things they'll be worried about in the day. If anything, they won't be worried about your brand at all because they don't care. So you just
let's start there.
Start there.
They've got loads on their plate,
exactly.
And you're not one of those.
Not
things.
one of them. So so I think getting close to your shopper is key, and we've done a lot around kind of mapping our market and understanding like where are the core demographics that we can play in, and therefore focus on those.
This is definitely going to be my soapbox of the year. Like, so many brands just forget to check that anyone wants what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that, like, this kind of iMac worldview of like, this is how I want my social to be and this is how everything's going to work. And the massive disconnect from what that means to someone in a Tesco superstore. It feels so obvious, and yet it's just like the mistake I just see over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's gonna be
exactly. Like bringing that into reality. I mean, we were working on a project around our formats, back to formats. Sounds like I'm obsessed about them. Maybe I do, but
because they work.
And we did a load of standing at shelf, and we were asking them about sizing and pricing, and what do you buy? And honestly, most people were just seriously confused about everything. They weren't necessarily. And things that you think that people might care about, they actually don't. And so it's
like
just,
what?
I don't know. It would be like we thought that maybe they would care about what size jar they buy, and they literally didn't give a shit. Like and that sounds like a really boring thing to say, but again, we assume that people are really like thinking when they get to shelf, and like really like mapping stuff, but actually they're quite impulsive, as we all know. They're impulsive.
The subconscious is pretty loud. Yeah, they're
really
just trying to get out the store.
Exactly. So it was kind of a bit of a reality check to be like, actually, I'm not sure. Like in terms of like system 1, system 2 thing, I'm not sure if they're like intuitively thinking about this. So I think it's not, perhaps when we're like wheedling away on something, they're not as.
But that's not to say that the wheedling isn't, like that wheedling, which I love that we're just like, the more I use that verb, the more I'm like, this is ridiculous.
I know.
Let's keep going with it.
Use it.
Yeah. It's like, it feels like there's a squirrel parallel in there. And the what you're trying to do is shape impulsive decisions.
Yeah.
So while someone's not processing cost per gram, they are going like big v small.
There's
£3
values
v
assumptions
£4.
being made.
Yeah. And that's incredibly transactional and shaped by very nuanced cues.
Back to your point, it's often quite nuanced and messy, and it's not as clear cut as you think it is, and so therefore sometimes you can get a bit in it because you're overthinking it, because there's lots of different opinions when you get to like quite one-on-one conversations with consumers.
Yeah. And you're also asking someone to intellectualise something that they've not thought about.
Exactly, yeah.
So all kinds of stuff comes up when you say to someone, why did you pick up that jar? And actually the answer is, my subconscious did it, I've got no idea.
Exactly, yeah. Which is both sort of slightly depressing when you're a brand building and you're thinking
I find it fascinating.
But then at the same time it's fascinating, to your point. It's one and the same, I think. Sometimes you're like, but I really like paid attention to where that particular thing on the packaging was, and they've not even clocked it.
I find it so humbling.
Yeah.
I think it's like, it's really levelling. It reminds you that you get on like the packed tube. If I get on the Central line at 8:30 and I'm like, all of these people are going to work, where are they going?
Yeah.
What is everyone doing? It's like everyone is thinking very deeply about something that no one else is thinking about.
Yeah, and often about themselves.
Yeah. And that like egalitarian thing of like, we're all just trying to progress some broadly insignificant thing in a way that might change behaviour.
Yeah.
I find it really fascinating.
Quite nihilistic about it all, though.
Well, it's like either we just all give up or we go.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
We're trying to change subconscious behaviour, and that's fascinating. Fundamentally, I do marketing because I think why someone buys something that they haven't bought before is just like the most bizarre. At some stage, we all walk into a shop and be like, today, it's that one.
Yeah, and
like,
it's...
What?
And it's the layers, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's and it's often... Again, it's the science and art of marketing. It's like, it'll be a number of nudges that sometimes lead someone to trying and tipping someone over the edge. Yeah. And I find that also really interesting, understanding like what drove you. And in some ways, in lots of ways, it reassures me that, you know, all the different tactics that you do, like maybe you haven't measured all of them. And certainly there's so much that we don't measure when we're talking about our like marketing activity, that it will be all contributing in some way, like even if it's not directly, you know, converting
the overlap
someone.
is unmeasurable. Like if you're running a D2C business, you talk about trying to get like blended attribution.
Yeah.
For an offline path to purchase, it is fundamentally unmeasurable to log the interactions with a brand that has taken, or the interactions with the category. Yeah. Like you don't know that they haven't had a terrible experience with someone else and therefore they're like switching out like this web of things that might influence the decision. I find the admission that it can't be measured.
Yeah.
Like we have a good go.
Yeah.
And that's what we can do. And we like lean into the fact that some of this is inherently unknowable. Again, I feel like really existential about this afternoon, but I find it quite relaxing. You go,
and like
okay,
it's all like based on big assumptions. If you've got like X number of million households you need to recruit, and how many times do you need to reach them, and what are the different ways that you're going to do it? You can ladder it all up.
Exactly.
But you can't necessarily then ladder it back, if you know what I mean. You can't take every bit of activity and be like, okay, well that delivered, you know, 50 people that we reached through that, or 1,000 people, whatever. It will be...
well, that was, you know, 50,000 second interactions with the brand, which we know will convert to 8th interaction into a purchase. Like that doesn't work. Yeah. So you have really robust assumptions and then an end result. Yeah. And bits of data along the way, and like that's the picture.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, back to my point right at the start, when you look back over, I think like a number of years of work, you can start to kind of get a sense on what you think is actually turning the dial versus things that maybe weren't. And I think it takes a bit of time, I think, to figure that out and refine it over the years.
What was a waste of time?
What was a waste of time? Hopefully no retailers listening to this. I think there's definitely been lots of shopper marketing that we've done that has been a very expensive way to get in front of people. And of course, some of it was probably pretty good, but certainly I know that some retailers are better at implementing things than others. And I think that was just, some of it was definitely wouldn't have paid back. It just was too expensive and didn't get the reach.
But you presumably you kind of know that going into it. Sometimes you look at a rate card and you're like, this can't
be it. So I think there's always not to say that we don't invest in retail media. We still do, and it's still part of our investment. But it's just choosing which retailers we do it in more specifically as well, I think is the key one. Other things that haven't worked so well, I think, like back to again, like knowing which products work better for sampling and things like that. Like our nut butters have been harder at different points to sample and whether they've really actually converted people. I think when you get we used to have like little mini sampling pots that we'd hand out, and if people weren't trying it in the moment at that point, especially if they're out and about, like I reckon more often than not, it probably never really went anywhere. So really for us, it was like we had to make sure the samples were in people's homes, like through, I don't know, a recipe box, and therefore we're more like instinctively going to try it.
Yes.
Or like actually served to them and they eat it there and then, but like something which kind of drifts a bit, like you just get a sample
in the bottom of a
street,
handbag,
or like or it just doesn't deliver. So those are probably a couple of examples, I guess.
Interesting. What have you learnt about hiring marketeers and building your team?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got the team's grown obviously over the years, and so Jack, my marketing director, we've worked together for coming up to 6 years in February, so a really long time. I know. And Jessie, who our head of brand, she's been with the business since she was the second employee, so she's nearly 9 years in February as well. So in lots of ways, like there's so much like knowledge in both of them. I mean, obviously my whole marketing team is brilliant, but I think over the years, like we've definitely like learned how to work together. And I think the relationship between the founder of the business and your marketing director, and still Jessie, she's head of brand, but she's very close, but she like intuitively, she's like very got a good read on it as much as I do as well, as does Jack. Learning about how you work together, I think it's like any relationship. There are definitely tougher bits where you recognise that you're not working as well together, and then other times where, and then you have to refine that. So even just basic stuff of like who makes the calls on certain things, and you know, especially creatively, like who gets the final decision. I think decisions are the main thing that you have to get really clear on, like where you start and stop as a founder, and where your marketing director also leads and makes the final call on things. And I think making sure that you're like both bringing each other on the journey in terms of what you're thinking. But yeah, I love it when me and Jack are having like one of our one-to-ones and she says something and I'm like, I was thinking exactly the same thing. And I think that comes over having worked together for a really long time, and she's got so much like built up knowledge about the brand and the consumer, because she's closer to the consumer, I think, than me, because she reads all of the like survey and insights, and she's really, she always, what I love about what she does is that I will pull on the consumer and bring it back to the consumer, but I probably sometimes will drift into like founder world and sort of want to be in my own head and vision ideas. And she'll always bring it back to like, why are we doing this? What's it mean to the consumer? And I really like that she constantly grounds and pulls us into that mindset if we're going a bit commercial or, you know, drifting. And I know that is the role of the marketing director, is to hold the consumer in the business. But she's always played that really strongly as in our team.
That's such a beautiful articulation of the point of a marketing director.
Yeah, God, it sounds bad, but in the first few years, I don't think we spoke about the consumer particularly. Which,
well, it's a tricky one because you don't necessarily have one.
Yeah, because I was sort of the pen. In the sense that I was that consumer.
I think it's okay to build for yourself for a bit.
Yes.
So long as you. Actually, I don't think I think that. I think yes, it's okay to build for yourself, but you've got to be very open to signs in the market.
Yeah, I think it's often when you start a business, you're problem solving. So you're often solving the problem for you as a consumer at the time. So there is a consumer that you're thinking of, it's you.
Yes.
And then there's a bit where your brand becomes separate from you and you have to recognise that you're not everything to it, and you need to sometimes sense check what you're thinking. And then as you evolve as a brand, so when you add new ranges, categories, and start to broaden out your audience base, you do actually need to, that's like the blind spot. Otherwise you're going to go blind into spending loads of money on not doing it very well. And I think the other thing, particularly like before Jack joined, and I think you remember this, we like didn't measure anything. Like we just did stuff all off intuition and had no sense on like where our awareness was, what our brand metrics were, so how healthy was it, and compared to our competitor set. And actually she brought real clarity into at least understanding what is happening with our brand in the market from a brand lens, not just from a category point of view. And that's been really helpful, at least understanding like where are our real strengths, like where do we over-index when it comes to taste or health or naturalness, and where are we needing to sharpen our kind of toolkit and therefore refine either our proposition, our comms tools and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I think that it's probably, especially for a very like brand-led founder, which is me, that's probably where I spend most of my time in marketing and product, as a lot of I think business owners do. Getting that relationship right is like fundamental, and it can really shape, because it really shapes the direction and look and feel of the brand and how you show up in the world, which is something you care so much about. So I'm sure it'll be interesting. Jack's probably got her own experiences of having to like navigate me as well, and like, you know, include me as well as also know when to be like, no, this is my marketing team. We're gonna run with this, and
it also hugely affects how much a business gets done.
Yeah.
Like
when really disruptive.
Exactly. When that's ineffective, it's disruptive, it's a huge distraction, it's a huge bottleneck, and it can kind of grind you into stasis.
Exactly, yeah.
So how have you, I love the way you talk about working on the relationship, and it feels very intentional. And clearly like people are sticking around. So that's always a sign that like that work is paying off. Yeah, exactly. How do you work on it? What does that look like?
Lots of honest conversations, both ways, like what's working, what's not. Like really defining how your decision-making process in your organisation, I think, not just for marketing, this is across the board.
And have you had to do that and redo it?
Yeah, and like it sounds boring, but we do have certain frameworks that we use, Rapid as an example. And like before you go into any project being like, what Rapid's being like, you know, who's responsible for making the recommendation, who makes the decision, that's the basic principle of it. But like calling it and being like, who is the decision maker on this? Because you can't have 5 decision makers around the table.
And you do that at the start of every internal project?
We try to, for like the big things in particular, try to define it up front.
We would get so much value out of it.
Yeah, because otherwise there were times, as an example, when we did limited editions, and this is when we realised there was a real bottleneck. It was a few years ago, and there was like a limited edition that we were rolling out. We've done loads of them in the past on our nut butters. Yet we kept on getting this like cyclical thing where we'd try and get to a flavour and suddenly it would go back into like the brainstorming because someone would throw an idea in or didn't agree with what we were trying to get to. And suddenly it was like, but the buck has to stop at some point.
Have to launch something.
To move on. And it just means that you take less the emotion, like remove the emotion from the conversation a little bit. And the idea that when a decision is made, everyone gets on board with it. And like you walk out of the room as a united front. But the important thing, and this is the key, is that the right people have inputted on any recommendation that's coming to you.
Yeah.
So that anyone that has an opinion that needs to have an opinion has at least been heard. And I think that's the key thing. And certainly I've had moments where maybe I felt like I should have had a bit more of a say on something. And that's when people get pissed off, I think, when they don't feel heard in the room. So you just need to kind of refine that decision making and how you do it in your organisation.
Well, it's both bad for business because you've got expertise that's not being
used,
factored, and also like a bruised ego, like it sends anyone off track. So that feeling, like an ego is probably a toxic way of talking. Like we all just want to be seen. And that feeling of not feeling seen and therefore valued is it's really difficult to stomach.
And everyone's going into wanting to work in an organisation to add value. So when you feel like you're not being enabled to do that, it's super frustrating. So I think...
And fascinating for you as a founder. Like if you've had moments where you're not being consulted, then you're like, what am I?
And I think none of that is in those moments is not because anyone's done anything to particularly piss. They haven't done it intentionally.
No.
It's all
presumably they're just trying to get stuff done.
Exactly. Everyone is just trying to get their job and do the best job they possibly can. So really, like, if you don't feel heard, it's probably because you haven't done the work to say what is important to you. So even sometimes between me and Jack, I'll be like, these are the 5 things that I really care about this year. And some of them within her marketing mix and what she's working on. And some of them probably are not like the biggest strategic stuff. But there could be, as an example, I've mentioned it a few times, but the Royal Parks activation. I really cared about how we showed up in that because it was one of our biggest ever sponsorships that we've ever done. And I really wanted it to feel great, like all the materials and the way that we kind of activated it. So it probably isn't something I should spend that much time on. And actually my team are brilliant, so they did a fantastic job and I didn't really turn the dial, I don't think. But I wanted to be on the journey with it. So I think flagging what are the things that you just will care about.
Yeah, I'm going to disproportionately care about this and I'm going to flag it up front.
It's a little irrational and I know it, but at least if you're open and communicative, you won't be like that disgruntled toddler in the corner, like being a bit annoyed and sitting on something. So as much as possible, I think just sharing those things and then you're more likely to just be on the journey.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I can think of the list I need to send around.
It's just getting it out. I think if it's sort of ruminating in the back of your mind, it's key. And I think the other thing is like just, I think there'll always be things as a brand that you're like, there'll be niggles and like things that you're like bugging you, whether it's like the paper substrate on this or that or this particular social media post or this. And it's trying to channel those somewhere and not share them all the time, just drip feed them in like this like really corrosive, and I'm not perfect at this,
and let some go
and let some go and just accept it. And then other times like either at least just like sometimes between me and Jack I will just say like these are the things that are really bugging me and I'll leave them with you, but I'm not going to go wider across the team. But it's more she's someone that can take it, but also just don't do it like constant little drips because it's really
I know, but
annoying.
I've had feedback of like, yes, only give it to the people who can take it, but also be mindful of how much they can take.
Also, that's true.
Because I've
That
had
is
feedback
true.
from
Yeah.
like my senior team who are like, look, I'm pretty thick-skinned for this, but
Yeah.
like, I can't handle your entire paranoia list.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, please do the first filter in your own head.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I have fully heard. Like,
Yeah.
I've really taken it on board,
Yeah.
but I think I had a naive view. I think I went through having no senior team to having a senior team and then being like, well, they can take everything.
Yeah, and just offload.
And just offloading, and then to like the slightly mature position on from that, which is like, they also need prioritization and like support. You can't just translate everything that was making you incapable of working onto them, because that's going to have the same effect.
Yeah, exactly. And that pause moment, I think, is like the thing to try and
the power of a bit of
like
reflection.
wait for like even 5 minutes can suddenly take the emotion out. And I think it's always emotion that's normally driving it in some form or another. So yeah,
it just lets that like why voice rise.
Yeah.
When you can be like, oh, I know why I really care about this, or actually this isn't about that. It's about something going on behind that. Like, it means you can
reflect a tiny bit. And
and you can communicate what's actually the problem.
Yeah.
Not that like, I don't like that post. It's like, oh, actually, I realise I don't like that post because I'm concerned that this is a drag in the way we're taking comms or whatever.
Yeah, exactly that. It's interesting because me and Jack do talk about like how much there's like two mindsets, I think, within startup, scale up, brand building generally is like, you know, as the leader, you should care about every detail because, you know, one broken window creates more broken windows. So actually, if you get that analogy, whilst at the same time allowing people to breathe and not breathing down their necks. And I really tussle with that, with how much to kind of be omnipresent and kind of people be aware that you're watching, whilst also leaving room for people to try, fail, get up again and go.
Yes.
And with brand building, I think I definitely learned, hence why I said earlier, like, I feel like we've got clarity, is that we've done a bit of the, like, again, it's not about frameworks. Actually, I actually normally quite hate the word frameworks. It normally sings to me like too much process and, you know, writing documents that never get looked at.
Yeah.
But I think back to my point around defining, for instance, really getting clear on your tone of voice. Like, we've done a whole piece of work on defining tone of voice, then training the team up on that tone of voice. And I think if you then get clear on it as a team and as a leadership team and within your marketing team, and then training and empowering them to do it well, like your team to do it well, then you can suddenly let go because you've like set the foundations. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of like running before you can walk with in the early stages, because you think everything just diffuses by osmosis. And we're not a massive team now. There's about 30 of us in the business, but there has been a bit of a, particularly with brand this year, like really just stopping and saying like, right, so what are like the key assets that we're going to make sure are visible? So for instance, white is an asset that we really hone across the brand, but over the years it started to drift into like more colours and beiges, and like actually as different people got their hands on it, and I kept on getting bothered because I didn't like the fact that, you know, these sort of creative was going out in the world. It wasn't in keeping with what I saw as the brand. And so my job and Jack's job is to then get complete clarity and write it down. And there is a point about writing things down sometimes that is super important. Otherwise, how on earth are people going to understand what it is in your head? And that's where the drip, drip, drip happens, because you've not even written it down for people to even have the best chance to succeed and then running with it, if that makes sense. So,
well, it becomes a complete stitch up.
Oh, yeah.
It's like you weren't telepathic about my brand guidelines, and so you're doing a bad job.
Exactly.
And that sounds farcical. Like, that sounds like a really silly statement, but I do so much coaching with people who are getting feedback from their bosses for literally not being telepathic.
Yeah. It's so unfair.
And it's like, this is not okay. And what normally happens is, yes, but X brand manager who's been with me for 10 years gets it. And you're like, let's just think about that sentence. Like, that's not because they're inherently better. That's because they've had their wrist slapped for a decade, so they get it.
Exactly.
You can't expect someone 6 months into a role that's not feedback on that person that they don't get it. It's that you haven't done the work. I know we're all really busy, but we have to acknowledge when we've not set people up for success.
And it is actually just a really satisfying moment when because like, for instance, we had lots of illustrations in our brand that evolved over time, and we had all these assets that we were like putting everywhere, and we were like, what is the role of all of these? We don't have enough money to make these like distinctive assets that people will look at and be like, that's Pip and Nut. So why are we
So what are they?
building all this crap that, no, it's not crap, it's lovely stuff, but it's like not actually.
Well, it's like extra.
It's
like lovely other things,
Yeah.
not who you are.
Exactly. And the same with tone of voice, like there were bits of copy that were going out and I'd be like, oh, that's a bit icky, like a bit kind of, oh, a bit cutesy. And we were almost going a bit too heavily on the squirrel, like foraging this and too many exclamation marks. And I was just getting intuitively like annoyed by it, and that too is exactly the moment where I was like, oh, and Jack, where we were like, we need to define this and actually hone it. And then, and that's where we're at right now. And it feels really pleasing, I have to say, because it's clear in my mind, and I think it's getting clear with the team. So I think that's a bit, sometimes that gets a little bit forgotten. You think all about like the tactics and how you're going to kind of, what are the different ways you're going to promote your brand and all the marketing mix, but actually getting some of that stuff done up front is also a fundamental part of like the overall.
There's a
work
really
to be done.
nice thread in kind of like this conversation, which is like, write down what your brand is, get really clear on that, work really hard at your key relationships like inside the business, because that really pays off.
Yeah.
And do enough framework that everyone knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And those are like such obvious fundamental pillars of a successful business, and yet so rarely done right.
And we're not perfect.
No one is perfect, but just know that they're important.
Yeah,
like
they have a
labeling them
role.
as important.
Yeah.
I think is quite breakthrough.
Yeah. And I think it's really hard to do some of that upfront stuff. Back to your point around, you're often moving at pace, you're signing off budgets fast, and it can feel like you're not really progressing by like stopping to pause and like clean up
miserable.
your house.
Yeah.
It's like doing the tidying, the spring clean, and actually it is really important because it will save some time hopefully down the line, for sure. I'm pretty confident that will be the case.
Time and money.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is, have you ever considered collaborating with brands already in these spaces, or do you feel like that would dilute the brand ethos?
Ooh.
So in the spaces that we're already within, so are there... Probably the short answer is no, because I think you'd be almost competitors, and therefore you'd almost be like
eating your.
I'm not sure if Grays would be up for a collab, and then I think it would probably be confusing. But yeah, we've done lots in the way of kind of collaborations, and it's still stuff that we kind of work on generally.
There are brands that use that as a way of dipping their toe in a new category.
Yeah.
So doing like I was going to say like Pip and Nut flavoured crisps, which would be a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But like
You never know.
Popcorn back in the day had a
yeah.
popcorn flavoured popcorn range, a peanut butter flavoured popcorn range. In a different world, you could have done Pip and Nut popcorn with a brand and then been like, okay, we've got a space in Impulse.
Yeah, and actually now I think about it, like in our Nut Buttercut range, like we aren't collaborating with them because it's slightly different, but we've moved all of our chocolate to the Tony's open chain. And actually, to be fair, we did ask them about whether they would be up for doing some form of collaboration. So technically both confectionery brands, but very different positioning because we're like a nut butter brand in confectionery as opposed to their pure play confectionery.
Yes.
So that would be one that I'd be like, absolutely yes. If Tony's, if you're there, like we're still here.
Anyone watching?
Please.
Make it happen.
But equally, you see it all the time with like grenade and Oreo, and or I think that was I think it was grenade and Oreo. So I think it depends how close you are. I think ultimately brand collaborations, you both need to be benefiting in some form or another. It's like, you need to get something from it. So maybe there's sometimes roles to play with, like, you often see Biscoff flavour coming into, bars and things like that. And actually I think it's like mainstream with something more like kind of up and coming challenger. And I think that's where you almost get like the most benefit. So at the moment, no, nothing in the pipeline, but you never know. Maybe it'll be an idea.
Ari says, as a father of a baby with cow's milk allergy, we were urged to get through as many allergens as quickly as possible. He hadn't considered the idea that there's so many varieties of nut butter. It's a great way to get protein into baby breakfast.
Yeah.
Has this baby solid food market been considered?
Yeah, it's an issue, isn't it? My daughter eats, honestly, like kilos worth of almond butter. It's like protein in yogurt. It's like, it's really, yeah, she loves it. I mean, it'd be weird if she didn't.
You've raised her in her veins.
Yeah. But baby food, probably no. I know there's lots of research that says that actually if you, as a mother eating nuts, like when you're pregnant, it's actually good because it helps
build up
the resilience to it, I guess. And then also that you should be, I won't give the month's date because I'll get it wrong and I don't want to, from a weaning point of view, I'm not an expert, but give nuts earlier on in like the weaning process so that actually they again do build resilience. So there is definitely a case for it. I would be still very nervous between like the baby space with nuts. I think regardless it's a tricky space, but I think that's partly also from our positioning from a family point of view is we recognise actually our products are eaten by a spectrum within the family and at different life stages in your family journey as well. But interestingly, we don't actually specifically target like babies or like people with very young kids, probably for that reason around allergens and things like that, even though there is a role obviously that we could play there.
Is there like a broader, feels like there's a broader thing there around if you're going to expand into other categories, make them huge?
Yeah.
Like, yes, there are big baby brands for sure.
Yeah.
But you're in confec and snacking.
Yeah.
Like, they're kind of different beasts.
Yeah,
Is that like playing into your macro?
Definitely, yeah. Thinking? One of our thinking was around nut butter is relatively a small category compared to where we're now going into, and actually we want to be able to reach consumers at all, more consumers with our brand and at different points in the day. So that was also the other mindset of like, this is predominant nut butter eaten at breakfast. Actually, we'd like to be able to help our consumers at different moments. Snacking is an obvious one, therefore, throughout the day. But yeah, absolutely. Like we wanted to leapfrog into a bigger category to kind of continue our growth journey. And yeah, you're right. Snacking is huge as is confectionery.
Pick big safe ones.
Yeah.
Final question.
Yes.
What is one thing that someone listening to this can help you with?
Yeah, I was thinking about that on my way here. I think I'd love to speak to people who've done multi-category. I'd love to understand how they've managed to balance that both sides of your business. And I mean that even as simply as how much did you invest as a percentage in one or the other area?
Yeah.
How much did you pull on your core to support something else that you're doing? And how much do you kind of think about master brand activations versus when you then go into kind of range by range, if that makes sense?
And by money and time?
Both, yeah.
Because it could be a huge time suck.
Yeah.
Even if you keep the cash stable.
Yeah, exactly. How did you resource internally? Did you create brand managers and from a commercial side, salespeople that focused on impulse, whereas the rest of the team focused on core?
Yeah.
And I hear different ways of doing it, and I'd love to speak to people about how you hone that, or lessons learned, because I think there probably are 1,000,001 different lessons learned. It's about doing that multi-category piece, which I think it's tricky.
Multi-category master brand.
Yeah.
All right, noted. I'll have a think.
Thank
and
you.
I'll forward you whoever slides into my
Please,
DMs.
come and
Yeah,
help
there
me.
will be. There always are.
Yeah.
And it's nice I can tell that the episodes are spiking again, because I'll just get a random email a year later being that's me. And I'm like, no, Pip, it's okay now.
Forward it on. Yeah.
I'll keep forwarding. Thank you so much for coming.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. If you loved the episode, please leave a review on Apple or Spotify, as it helps us grow and get more brilliant guests on for you. If you want to hear more real insights from the life of a founder in startup marketing, do give me a follow on LinkedIn or on TikTok. I'd love to connect. And that is a wrap until next time. Remember, you can always get in touch to recommend who we should interview next or what you'd like us to chat about.